Welcome to another deep dive. We're tackling something a bit different today. We're going to zero in on this book called How to Teach English by Jeremy Harmer.
Yeah.
It was written back in 1998, but it's still really relevant today. And we're looking at this from the perspective of the learner. You know, our listeners out there are probably coming across all kinds of different ideas and theories and methods for language learning.
Right.
But we want to try to distill some core concepts. So we're doing a deep dive into this one source.
Yeah, and there are a lot of different sources out there, but this one kind of brings together a lot of the important ideas about teaching and learning a language.
Okay.
So it's a good one to dive into.
So even if you've never thought about teaching before, this is going to give you some insights into how language actually works in our brains.
Yeah.
And you know how we can learn more effectively. Our mission today is to kind of unpack those fundamental principles
Wow.
and then see what kind of surprising insights they offer.
Yeah, because I think, this book, it's targeted at teachers, but there's so much in here that's relevant to anybody who's learning a language.
Yeah.
No matter what language you're learning. These are fundamental principles. So you're right. I think the mission is to unpack those and see what we can glean from that.
Okay, so let's dive right in. The first thing we're going to talk about is the importance of the student's motivation,
Right.
which sounds kind of obvious, but it turns out that since World War II, there's been a real shift in the way we think about this. And it's not just about having the right methods. It's not just about having the best textbook or the coolest app or whatever.
Right. It's not just about the tools that you're using, but something much more fundamental than that, which is that, the learner's desire to actually learn.
Right.
So this is something that researchers started to look into back in the middle of the 20th century. And people like Gardner and Lambert really highlighted that, learners who really had this kind of integrative motivation. What they meant by that is that they were interested in the culture where the language is spoken. They wanted to integrate
Right.
with the people in that culture, and often those learners did much better.
So you might find as a language learner that if you connect to English-speaking culture through music or film or, any other way,
Right.
that actually helps you
Yeah.
learn the language more than just the grammar rules and stuff.
Absolutely. And then, of course, there's the other kind of motivation, which is called instrumental motivation,
Right.
which is, when you're learning a language for a very specific purpose.
Yeah.
You want to get a job.
Yeah.
You want to be able to travel. You need it for a very specific reason.
Right.
And both of those kinds of motivation are very powerful. But the important thing to remember is that, highly motivated students generally achieve better results,
Right.
regardless of aptitude.
So it doesn't matter if you think you're good at languages or not. If you're motivated,
Right.
you'll do better.
Yeah, and I think that's a really key point because, sometimes people think, well, I'm just not good at languages, and so I'm never going to be able to do it. But actually, research has shown that even if you don't think you have a natural aptitude for it,
Yeah.
if you're really motivated,
You can still do it.
you can still make progress
Right.
and become really fluent.
So I guess that's a really important question for our listeners to ask themselves is, why am I learning English?
Yeah,
And to really kind of reconnect with that initial reason or find new reasons if you've been at it for a while,
right.
just to kind of get that motivation back,
Right.
because that's the key.
Yeah,
And, for teachers, Harmer talks about how important it is to foster interest and, keep that motivation high
yeah.
by keeping the content relevant to students' needs and interests.
Right.
Okay, so another really important thing is the idea that students need to take responsibility for their own learning. This is something that's really important in a lot of, modern language learning institutions and language teaching programs. It's often called self-study.
Yeah, self-study. And I think the important thing to remember here is that teachers provide a framework.
Right.
They provide the materials and the classroom environment, but a lot of the learning that happens is outside the classroom.
Right.
The students have to do homework.
Right.
They have to think about what they need to work on. And so there's a lot more expectation on the student to be responsible
Right.
for their own learning now.
Now, this might be a shift for some learners who come from educational backgrounds where the teacher is more directive and the student is expected to just sort of receive information passively.
Right. I mean,
Mm.
especially if you come from an educational background where, The teacher's role is to tell you everything, and you just sort of passively take it in, and that's how you learn.
Yeah.
This is quite a different idea that actually you, as a learner, you need to take responsibility.
Yeah.
You need to set your own study habits.
Right.
You need to decide what you need to work on.
And if you get stuck, you need to, look for the answer.
Exactly. And I think that's, it's kind of a challenge, but it's also really exciting because it means that you can actually kind of shape your own learning.
Right.
You know,
Yeah. It's really empowering.
it is.
So it's a partnership between the teacher and the student.
Absolutely.
The teacher provides the roadmap, the tools.
Yeah.
And the student has to be willing to actually do the work.
Yeah. I mean, it really is a kind of a partnership.
Right.
The teacher can't do it all.
Right.
The student can't do it all. They have to work together
Right.
to make it successful.
Okay. So if you are taking responsibility for your own learning and you are motivated, it's helpful to know that there are different levels of language acquisition and different teaching approaches that are appropriate for those different levels.
Right.
Uh,
And it's really important to understand that because, what's really motivating and really helpful for a beginner might be completely different from what's helpful for somebody at a more advanced level.
Right.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all.
Right. So let's break it down into those different levels. So for beginners, success is often tied to very clear, achievable goals.
Right.
Very simple goals that they can achieve quite easily.
Yeah.
And then from that, they build confidence. And it's really important to create a stimulating and encouraging atmosphere where they feel comfortable
Right.
making mistakes and, trying things out.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that can be really off-putting for beginners is if you kind of throw really complex grammar
Right.
at them, too early,
Yeah.
they're just not ready for it.
You don't want to overwhelm them.
No, you don't want to overwhelm them. You want to keep it fun. You want to keep it engaging. You want to keep it simple.
Right.
So I think, that sense of, small, achievable goals is really important.
So if you're a beginner just starting out, is it fair to say that just focusing on being able to communicate some basic things is more important than worrying about,
Absolutely.
all the verb conjugations and all that stuff?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, being able to communicate is the main goal.
Right.
The grammar will come,
Right.
but I think the important thing is to just get started, to just start speaking.
Okay, so then we move on to the intermediate level. So these are students that, have got a bit of a foundation now.
Right.
They, handle some basic conversations, but what do they need at that point?
I think at the intermediate level, it's really important that students can see that they're still making progress.
Right.
Because often, they've grasped the basics,
Yeah.
but they're not yet fluent.
Right.
And so they can feel like they're in this kind of in-between stage.
Yeah.
And they can get a bit stuck.
Right.
So I think it's really important to give them tasks that challenge them, but where they can also see that they're making progress.
Right. So those goals have to be achievable, but they still have to be challenging.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So you don't want to, make it too easy
Yeah.
because then they'll get bored.
Right.
But you don't want to make it so difficult that they get discouraged.
Right.
So it's about finding that right level of challenge.
Right. And then finally, we get to the advanced students. So they've clearly put in a lot of work.
Right.
They've got a really good grasp of the language.
Yeah.
What do we focus on at that point?
Well, I think at that point, it really becomes much more about the subtleties of the language.
Right.
It's about understanding nuance. It's about using language that's appropriate for the situation,
Yeah.
which we call register.
Right.
It's about, appreciating different styles of communication.
Right.
And it's about, being able to tackle much more complex language,
Yeah.
longer, pieces of writing or longer spoken, utterances.
Yep.
So it really becomes much more about kind of the finer points.
And these students are usually ready to take a lot more responsibility for their learning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, they can set their own objectives.
Yeah.
They can, research, areas that they're interested in.
Right.
They can really kind of take ownership of their learning
Okay.
in a much bigger way.
So it really shows how teachers need to be adaptable to these different levels.
Absolutely.
Okay, now we're going to talk about something that might sound a little bit technical or jargony,
Right.
but it's really quite simple. It's called ESA.
ES.
And it's a framework that a lot of teachers use to structure their lessons. So ESA stands for Engage, Study, Activate.
Yeah.
And it's a really common and really effective way to think about how a lesson actually flows.
Right. And I think For a learner, what this means is that, effective learning often involves, you know, getting interested in something,
Right.
really engaging with it, then understanding, the mechanics of it,
Right.
the grammar, the vocabulary,
Right.
and then being able to actually use it.
Right.
So it's that kind of three-stage process.
Okay, so let's break down those stages. So what happens in the engage phase?
So in the engage phase, the teacher's really trying to, you know, spark the student's interest
Right.
to get them emotionally connected to the topic.
Okay.
Um, this could be through games, through discussions, through telling stories, anything that gets them,
Get their attention.
gets their attention, gets them curious,
Right.
and really kind of thinking in English.
Right. And then we move on to the study phase.
So in the study phase, now that they're interested, now that they're engaged,
Yeah.
it's time to actually focus on the language.
Okay.
So this is where the teacher will, explain the grammar rules, will introduce the vocabulary,
Right.
will, work on pronunciation. So it's the more analytical part of the lesson
Okay.
where you're really looking at the nuts and bolts
Right.
of the language.
And then finally, the activate phase.
So the activate phase is where students get the chance to actually use the language,
Right.
more freely
Right. Yeah.
to communicate.
Mhm.
So this could be through role plays. It
Okay.
could be through debates.
Okay.
It could be through telling stories,
Right.
anything where they're trying to get their message across.
Right.
And they're not too worried about, being grammatically perfect
Right.
or
Yeah.
using, the exact right vocabulary.
So the focus is more on fluency at that point.
Exactly.
Okay, now Harmer talks about different ways that you can sequence these stages.
Right.
Like straight arrows and boomerang. What's
Yeah.
the difference?
So a straight arrows lesson is kind of the classic engage,
Right.
then study, then activate.
Okay.
So, you get them interested in a topic,
Mm,
you present the language, and then you get them to practice it.
right.
The boomerang's a little bit different
Okay.
because it starts with engage and then it goes straight into activate. And the idea is that the students will encounter a problem.
Okay.
They'll realize that they don't have all the language they need to complete the task.
Okay.
So that then leads into a need for study.
Right.
So they study the language and then they go back to activate and try again.
So the need for the language comes out of the activity itself.
Exactly.
Okay.
So
yeah.
the students encounter a real need for the language,
Right.
and that makes the study phase much more meaningful
Right.
because they could see why they need it.
They've felt the gap in their knowledge.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And then he also mentions patchwork.
So patchwork lessons are much more flexible,
Okay.
and the teacher might use, different sequences
Right.
of to engage, study, and activate depending on what they're trying to achieve in that part of the lesson.
Okay. So it's a more kind of mix and match
Exactly.
approach.
Yeah.
Okay. So it seems like this ESA framework, and especially the emphasis on activate, really points to this kind of communicative way of teaching.
Yeah.
Harmer briefly mentioned something called PPP,
Right.
which is, an older way of structuring lessons.
Yeah. PPP stands for Presentation Practice Production.
Oh, okay.
And it was a very common model, maybe 10, 20 years ago.
Right.
And the idea is that the teacher presents the new language.
Right.
The students practice it in a very controlled way,
Right.
often through exercises.
Right.
And then maybe they get a chance to produce it more freely.
Okay.
But the focus is very much on accuracy.
Right.
And the communicative aspect is not really there so much.
Right.
Whereas, communicative language teaching, which ESA fits into much better,
Right.
really prioritizes that activate stage,
Right.
getting students to use the language for real communication.
Right.
So it's a very different approach.
Okay, so now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what we're actually teaching and learning, which is the English language itself.
Right.
And Harmer goes into how complex it is to describe a language.
Yeah.
But he starts with the sentence structure
Right.
and how sentences are structured.
Yeah. So he talks about, the kind of the typical subject, verb, object, complement, adverbial
Right.
order that we often see in English.
Right.
And then he moves on to talk about, the different types of words that make up those sentences.
Okay, so the parts of speech.
The parts of speech, exactly.
Like nouns, verbs, adjectives.
Exactly.
And he breaks those down even further.
He does, yeah. So, he looks at nouns and he talks about, countable and uncountable nouns,
Right.
singular and plural nouns, collective nouns like family, team,
Okay.
compound nouns like toothbrush.
Right.
And he even talks about noun phrases, which are, groups of words that act like a noun.
Right.
So he really goes into quite a lot of detail.
Okay. And then we have verbs, which are, a whole world unto themselves.
Yeah, I mean, verbs are where it gets really complicated.
Yeah.
So he talks about, auxiliary verbs like be and have,
Right.
and main verbs,
Okay.
and phrasal verbs,
Yeah.
which can be really tricky.
Yeah.
Things like look up or give in.
Yeah.
And he also talks about, the different verb tenses.
Right. Present, past, all that stuff.
Present, past, continuous, perfect.
Yeah.
He talks about active and passive voice.
Yeah. Right.
And he talks about, verb complementation, which is how verbs connect with other parts of the sentence.
Right.
So there's a lot to cover.
Yeah. It feels like we're just scratching the surface here.
Yeah, we are. I mean, there's a whole book on this.
Right. What other things does he talk about?
Well, he also talks about pronouns,
Right.
so personal pronouns like you, me, he, she, it, they.
Yeah.
Relative pronouns like who, which, that.
Okay.
He talks about adjectives,
Okay.
including, comparative and superlative adjectives,
Right.
and the order of adjectives, which can be quite tricky in English.
Yeah.
He talks about adverbs, the different types of adverbs,
Right.
and where they go in the sentence.
Okay.
He talks about prepositions, articles,
Right.
like an
Okay.
and conjunctions and conditionals.
Right.
So he really covers a lot of ground.
Right. And one really interesting thing he talks about is the idea that one form can have many meanings.
Right.
And conversely, many forms can have the same meaning.
Exactly.
Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, sure. So, you could take a very simple word like run.
Okay.
So run can be a verb.
Right.
I run every day.
Mm-hmm.
But it can also be a noun.
Right.
That was a good run.
Yeah.
And it can even be part of a phrasal verb
Okay.
with a completely different meaning.
Okay.
Like we ran into an old friend.
Right.
So one form, run,
Yeah.
but many different uses and meanings.
Right.
And conversely, you could think about how many different ways there are to say hello in English.
Yeah.
Hi, hey, good morning, how's it going?
Right.
All of those have the same basic meaning,
Right.
but they're different forms.
So many forms, one meaning.
Exactly.
Okay, he also mentions these things called language functions and collocations.
Yeah.
What are those all about?
So language functions are the reasons why we use language.
Right.
So things like asking for information,
Okay.
offering help,
Right.
apologizing, giving advice.
Okay.
So these are the kind of the communicative purposes
Right.
for which we use language.
Okay. And then collocations.
Collocations are words that just naturally go together in English.
Okay.
So for example, we say heavy rain.
Right.
We don't say strong rain.
Right.
Or we say make a decision.
Yeah.
We don't say do a decision.
Right.
So knowing these collocations can really help your English sound much more natural
Right.
because they're the words that native speakers just naturally put together.
Okay. And finally, he talks about spoken English.
Right.
And how it differs from written English.
Yeah. And I think this is really important for learners to be aware of
Okay.
because, spoken English has its own characteristics.
Right.
We use contractions a lot.
Like I'm and can't and that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're there, all of those contractions,
Right.
which we don't normally use in writing.
Right.
We also use a lot of what we call discourse markers,
Okay.
which are words like, well, like I mean.
Right.
And these words don't really have a lot of meaning in themselves,
Right.
but they help us to organize our speech
Right.
and to connect with the listener.
Yeah.
And then crucially, spoken English also uses paralinguistic features,
Okay.
like stress and intonation and rhythm
Right.
to convey meaning,
Right.
which you obviously don't have in writing.
Right. So you can say the same words, but how you say them
Exactly.
conveys a different meaning.
Exactly. You can say something like, I'm fine.
Right.
But you can say it in a way that means you're really not fine.
Right.
Or you can say it in a way that means you are fine.
Right.
So it's the way you say it
Yeah.
that really matters.
Okay. So all of those things go into, making up the English language, which we're trying to teach.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So now let's move on to the actual skills of language teaching, the practical stuff.
Right.
So how to teach reading.
Okay.
What are some important things to keep in mind there?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that, there are different ways that we read.
Okay.
Sometimes we're reading for gist, which means we're just trying to get a general idea of what the text is about.
Right.
And sometimes we're reading for specific information,
Okay.
which we call scanning.
Right.
So, not every reading task requires the same kind of attention.
Right. So you don't always have to read every single word carefully.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think another important point is that, before you even start reading,
Yeah.
it's a really good idea to engage with the topic, to think about what you already know about the topic,
Right.
because that will help you to understand the text better,
Right.
and it'll also make it more interesting for you.
Okay.
And then in terms of activities,
Yeah.
there are lots of different activities that you can do with reading texts,
Right.
and they should be appropriate for the level of the students.
Okay.
So, for beginners, it might be something as simple as matching headlines to short news items.
Okay.
For intermediate learners, it might be, putting the sentences of a paragraph
Right.
in the correct order.
Right.
So, the tasks should be tailored to the learner's abilities.
Okay. So how about writing?
Okay.
But that's often a very challenging skill for language learners.
It is, yeah.
So why do we teach it and how do we teach it?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons why we teach writing.
Okay.
Firstly, it helps to reinforce what students have learned.
Right.
So if they've been studying a particular grammar point or a particular vocabulary set,
Yeah.
writing gives them an opportunity to actually use it
Right.
and to kind of consolidate their learning.
Right.
Secondly, I think it improves their overall language skills.
Okay.
So even if they're not specifically practicing, grammar or vocabulary when they're writing,
Yeah.
they're still thinking in English.
Right.
They're still having to, organize their thoughts
Right.
and express themselves clearly.
Right.
So it really helps to develop their overall fluency.
Okay.
And then thirdly, I think it caters to different learning styles.
Right.
So some people are very visual learners.
Yeah.
Some people are more auditory learners.
Right.
But some people are what we call kinesthetic learners,
Okay.
which means they learn best by doing things.
Right.
And writing is obviously a very kinesthetic activity.
Right. You're actually using your hands.
You're actually using your hands
Right.
to produce something.
Okay, so there are a lot of different writing activities you can do, from very simple things like, filling in a form to, writing a short story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, writing activities can be anything from, very short, simple tasks, like you say, filling out a form,
Yeah.
writing a postcard,
Okay.
to much longer, more complex tasks, like writing a story or an essay or a report.
Okay.
And again, the tasks should be appropriate
Right.
for the level of the students.
And they can be integrated into the Engage, Study, Activate framework,
Absolutely, yeah.
just like the other skills.
Yeah.
Right.
So, you might engage students with a topic.
Right.
You might study some language that's relevant to that topic.
Right.
And then you might get them to do a writing activity that uses that language.
Right.
And then Harmer also just briefly mentions, handwriting,
Right.
which is obviously important, particularly for younger learners.
Right. Yeah. It's a whole other skill
Yeah.
that we won't get into today.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about speaking now.
Okay.
This is often the skill where learners feel the most nervous.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, speaking is often seen as the most difficult skill
Yeah.
because it's the one where you're kind of most exposed.
Right.
You're putting yourself out there.
Right.
And, people are judging you.
Right.
So it's understandable that learners feel nervous about it.
Yeah. So what can teachers do to make learners feel more comfortable speaking?
I think the first thing is to create a supportive and encouraging atmosphere in the classroom,
Right.
where students feel like it's okay to make mistakes,
Right.
and where they're not going to be ridiculed
Right.
if they say something wrong.
Right.
And then secondly, I think it's important to give students lots of opportunities to practice speaking.
Right.
And, these opportunities should be as realistic as possible.
Okay.
So, rather than just getting students to do kind of, abstract grammar exercises,
Right.
Get them to do role plays,
Right.
get them to have discussions,
Okay.
get them to, give presentations,
Right.
things that they might actually have to do in real life.
And those speaking activities should often lead to that activation phase
Absolutely.
that we talked about in ESA.
Exactly. Yeah.
So they're actually using the language.
Yeah. I mean,